When we say God is creator, here's one of the things we mean. We mean that God caused the universe, caused all things to come into being from nothing. God did not use prior existent material to make the world. God made it out of no other thing. He spoke it into being. Let there be. Let it be. And so it was. The word for this, the term for this in Latin, we're going to give you some good Latin phrases to throw down with your loved ones. Convince them all that you're getting your money's worth. The Latin term for this is creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. Not even space and time, nothing. Space and time are properties of things. No things, no such properties. To give you a picture of this, God made Israel, to give us a sense of how this can be. And this is not a perfect analogy, but I mentioned it last time. Moses reminds Israel, your very being is the sheer gift of God. God didn't make you out of some other nation, some earlier nation. God brought you about from a man and a woman who were both too old to make anything. That's a kind of creation out of nothing. I mean, it's not strictly speaking creation out of nothing, but it gets close. God isn't just a potter that goes out and gets clay and then shapes it. God makes the clay. To get a sense of this relationship, I think it's helpful to look at alternatives. To get a sense of what we mean by creatio ex nihilo. Or another term at the beginning here, unmediated creation, or first creation. To get a sense of it, it's helpful to look at alternatives that don't understand the world that way. I'm not disproving these today, and I don't mean to mock them in any way, just to show you what's at stake in what Christians, and in this case Israel as well, distinctly believe about the Creator. So let's look at a few of them. The first one I want to show you is polytheism. Polytheists saw and see the universe as arising from many causes, many powers, not just one. Dualists reduce the number of agents, ultimate agents, to two. Light and darkness, maybe. Yin and yang. Well, what difference does it make? Well, how do you live differently if you're a polytheist? Polytheism does get mocked a lot in Scripture, and the classical Greek philosophers didn't think much of it either. So there are multiple origins of traditions that are disrespectful towards polytheism, but not everyone believed that polytheism was a bad idea. Arthur Schopenhauer thought it was better than monotheism in some ways. Try to think for a minute like a polytheist. You pay attention, you're intelligent, you live in a complicated world, and you notice this world has a lot of different features. You know, you go to an old science class at Pagan U, and they teach you to look around, and what do you see? You start journaling what you see. Well, there's this huge, hot, yellow ball, circle anyway, disk, that comes up in the east, and it slowly glides to another place in the west, following an arc. And the next morning it's back in the east. Well, what should we call that? I don't know, let's be good, careful scientists and call it X. We've isolated a variable. Or if X is a little too undescriptive, let's call it the sun force. Or if you're Egyptian, let's call it Ra. Then there's other things you notice. You notice these white puffy things that float through the sky. And they don't follow the same course as the sun. They have a whole different direction. They come from a different place. They go to a different place. Sometimes that shifts, whereas the sun, that follows an extremely regular course. Sometimes the clouds block the sun. Sometimes there are so many that you can't see the sky at all. Other times there's just a few, and the sun actually withers them away and makes them disappear. Are you going to call that X? Not if you're a good scientist. You're going to call it Y, right? You're going to call it by a different variable because it seems to have a different cause, a different character. In fact, because the sun force and the cloud force, we could call it wind maybe, seem sometimes to be at odds. They don't look like they're all part of one big picture. They look like they're competitors, like they're in conflict. Sometimes water comes out of those clouds, the rain force. Sometimes it doesn't. The rain force, that's a whole different thing. That comes down, not over. Sometimes it seems like it's related to the sun. There are seasons where it's rainy and seasons where it's dry. So maybe they're working on the same side. On the other hand, the rain blocks out the sun and the sun evaporates the rain. So maybe they're competitors. Maybe they're at war. Maybe every year there's a kind of battle between one force and another force. Sometimes one is ascendant and other times another one is ascendant. Then there's the life force. By the way, if you want a name for the rain force and you're a Canaanite, you call it Baal. All right. What about life? Life is not just a function of each of those things. Life comes out of the ground. Life force seems to draw on some of these other forces, but other times they seem at odds as well. Too much water and it washes away. Too much sun, it dries up and dies. We live in a pretty precarious world, it turns out, don't we? We're at the mercy of all of these different elements, all of these different primal forces that are at odds with one another. I'm not writing mythology, I'm just observing, I'm just doing science. When I try to understand how all this came about, I'm going to try to extrapolate origins, or I'm going to try to extrapolate a prehistory that got us to where we are today. And that's what nations are doing in the ancient world. Who says that a world like this has one cause? It seems crazy. You know, you don't want to be the one in the class whose answer to every question is the same answer. That's unimaginative, and you're going to be wrong most of the time. It's Israel. Israel seems crazy to say, yeah, the disk in the sky, God made that. The rain, God sends that. The wind, God directs those. Life, God breathed that. How convenient. What else did God do? Everything. How do you live differently in that case? Well, the world is not such a precarious place. The world has an underlying sensibility, an underlying harmony. Even when things seem dramatically wrong, that's only a season. That's only for the moment. Maybe it's not even bad at all. We haven't talked yet about sin. That's a different consideration. We're just talking about nature at this point. The story of the creating of that world is going to be rather beautiful. Whereas the polytheist creation stories, they tend to be rather violent. Who's read the Enuma Elish? So can you see where it gets its dramatic shape? Here's the beginning of the Enuma Elish. When the heavens above were yet unnamed and the name of the earth beneath had not been recorded, Apsu, the oldest of beings, their progenitor, Mumu, Tiamat, who bare each and all of them, their waters were merged into a single mass. That sounds a little tiny bit like Genesis 1, doesn't it? Like one of them's riffing on the other. Only this isn't exactly the same old story. A field had not yet been measured, a marsh had not yet been searched out, when of the gods none was shining, a name had not been recorded, a fate had not been fixed. The gods came into being in the midst of them. Well, it's not going to be long before they start brawling here in verse 25. Apsu could not diminish their brawl, and Tiamat gathered herself together and struck a blow Anyway, Tiamat ends up dying, and her corpse becomes the universe. Isn't that beautiful? Some of the same imagery that you see in Genesis 1, but a radically different story that leads you to live in a radically different way. And if things are out of balance in this world, what are you going to do? What are you going to do in Southern California if there's a drought and there's too much sun and not enough rain? Well, you're not going to pray to Israel's God. You're going to pray to Baal. Come on. Give us some rain. Trouble is, there's more than 4 forces in the universe, right? There are seemingly infinite forces. And if we're at the mercy of all of them, how can we know how to balance our lives? Well, it's a balancing act. It's a trick. You got to make sure that each of your gods is in the right proportion, that you're sort of have a good relationship with each of them. You don't want to upset anyone. When one of them gets on a rampage and starts storming heaven, you need to know what to do about it. One of my Old Testament professors said, Americans are pretty good at living like polytheists. We hedge our bets. We diversify our portfolios. We make sure that we're covered in the case of any number of catastrophes. We insure our assets, pool them, etc. Here Israel's coming along and saying, our insurance is Yahweh. Our whole insurance is the God of Israel because everything is under his reign. It's an astonishingly different life. In a way, these different peoples live in completely different imaginative worlds. I mean, they're under the same sky, but they're in imaginatively, narratively, totally different worlds. Well, another couple of rivals, another couple of rival ways of understanding the origin of all things. One of them is pantheism. Pantheists argue that all is God, that there's no distinction between the cause of the universe and the universe itself. It is all one, which means God did not cause the universe to come into being. The universe is self-caused, self-realized. We are God or the gods, doesn't really matter which, being God. All right? The Indian flag has as its center the wheel of life. The cyclical process of being dharma, of being reality. And there's nothing outside it or outside us. We're all just part of the same self-caused thing. Well, that's a radical alternative to creatio ex nihilo, right? An alternative, another alternative, an opposite alternative, or maybe not such an opposite, is atheism. For atheists, the universe is all there is. There's no external cause of the universe. The universe is self-caused, self-realized, developing or evolving on its own energy and in its own way. And so atheists think it's inappropriate to use the language, the word God. It can't refer to something else outside what is. Now those seem like opposites, pantheism and atheism, but they're really not, are they? They're really much closer to one another than either one is close to Israel's faith. It's hard to tell the difference between atheism and pantheism, except maybe whether you attribute consciousness to the universe. And it would be hard to know what that were anyway, except by some human analogy. So, do you live differently if you're a pantheist/atheist than if you're Israel? Well, yeah, right? Israel looks for its being and for its deliverance to one God who is not itself. That can't be how these react. You'd be waiting forever. You'd be waiting for Godot. When Israel uses the word good to describe the universe, it's describing it in terms of a character given to it by its creator. God's goodness means creation's goodness. And what's wrong with creation isn't doesn't have a counterpart in God. What's wrong with creation is really a departure from its resemblance to God. It's a failure. Pantheists and atheists, like polytheists and dualists, they cannot make that move. Good and evil have to be just apparently dissimilar attributes of a common thing. Right? So Nietzsche argues to be beyond God is to be beyond good and evil. If God doesn't exist, Europeans should stop their talk about goodness. There's only will. There's only power. Good or evil is a relic of a belief that isn't true. Or it's a word we use for what we like and what we don't like, for preferences. Another alternative that's very influential culturally and philosophically in Christianity's early days is Platonism. Plato thought that the universe is like the fallout of the overflowing of being. That the creator, so to speak, is perfection itself, which being infinite overflows into something that's a little less like itself, which begets something else that's a little less like itself. And so the highest realm, the realm of the good, is also the ideal, immaterial, perfect world of the forms. And we live in this departure from that world, this inferior, changing, imperfect world of material, of stuff. And the goodness of our world is like the imprint of the ideal on the material world. It's like you took a beautiful sculpture mold and you used it to shape Rice Krispie treats, which you could kind of recognize something. Maybe that's a Rodin sculpture. Maybe that's the thinker, but it's in Rice Krispie treats. You don't get quite the same perfection because the material is inferior. It's just not up to the task. Platonism understands that God, if you want to use the word, is this force acting on a material world, but really sort of at the mercy of its limits. You can only do so much with Rice Krispie treats, even if you're Rodin. All right? God didn't make the universe out of nothing then. God, or the ideal, or the good, has made a kind of imperfect, fleeting impression on an inherently poorer material world. And therefore, the universe isn't all that great. The universe pre-existed and God came along like a potter buys clay and does what he can with the clay. But the clay might not, in fact, isn't terribly suitable for the purpose. A kind of contemporary intellectual counterpart here draws on philosophers like Hegel and actually draws on the evolutionary mindset of modern progressivism to argue that not just is the universe coming into being, but God is coming into being along with the universe. It's like we're co-evolving. Which means the universe isn't perfect and God isn't perfect. It's just coming along. We're all just coming along together. Which means, in a sense, that God is at the mercy of the limits of the universe. And vice versa. We're at the mercy of a limited God. So, over against the first group, our universe has one cause, and so our universe has at least potentially an inner harmony and coherence. Over against pantheism and atheism, our universe has a cause outside itself. And so we can measure and know who we are by reference to what is not ourselves. And so we can use words like goodness or badness. Over against Platonism and process theology, the very stuff of our universe, is from God, and therefore is adequate to God's task, adequate to God's purpose.